On the morning of the 6th of September, something very unusual happened. At the African Development Summit in Addis Ababa, before hundreds of journalists and many world leaders, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso spoke directly to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He did not hide his words. He did not speak in complicated diplomatic language. Looking straight into the camera, Traoré said, "Mr. Netanyahu, you have 12 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." This was not a threat of war. It was about dignity. The entire hall went silent. Within minutes, the video spread across the world, creating heated debates from South Africa to the United States. Why did this happen? Days earlier, a private meeting of the G7 was leaked. Reports said Mr. Netanyahu used offensive words about African leaders. He called them naive and opportunists when they criticized Israel's campaign in Gaza. Some diplomats even said he used harsher terms like crude and theatrical. On top of that, he was said to support new debt pressures on African nations through the IMF, and even suggested a Western-backed alliance that could leave Africa powerless. When this leak became public, people were furious, but Traoré stayed silent until the summit. At the podium, he spoke firmly. "Mr. Netanyahu, Africa will not be your pawn. We will not accept debt chains or experiments from the West. This is not about alliances. This is about dignity. You have 12 hours to apologize, or you will no longer be welcome in Africa in trade, in diplomacy, or in history." The room froze. Journalists stopped typing. Delegates stared at each other in shock. At that moment, Burkina Faso was no longer just a small country in West Africa. It became the center of a global debate about respect, sovereignty, and the future of African diplomacy. The moment President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stepped down from the stage, the 12-hour countdown began, and the world reacted instantly. Across Africa and far beyond, social media caught fire. On Africa News, the story filled the front page. TikTok and Facebook lit up, gathering millions of views within just a few hours. But the reaction was not only online. In government buildings, classrooms, and community centers, people repeated his words. For many Africans, this was not just politics. It was a rare, clear voice standing up to years of being ignored in world decisions. The first wave of support came from South Africa. Police Minister Fikile Mbalula reposted the viral clip with a short yet powerful message. At last, someone speaks out. To him, it was more than a statement. It was a wake-up call to the entire world. Soon after, a former Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations wrote, "This is the future of African diplomacy, fearless and incorruptible." His words spread quickly, becoming a rallying point for a new vision of the continent's role on the global stage. From East Africa to West Africa, from political leaders to voices in civil society, one sentiment stood above the rest. President Ibrahim Traoré had spoken with uncommon courage. For many, he had just opened a new chapter in Africa's diplomatic history. Meanwhile, Israel's response appeared strikingly weak. Netanyahu's office issued only a brief denial of the leaked remarks, carefully avoiding any reference to Traoré's demand. That silence poured fuel on the fire, deepening the tension. For many Africans, it was yet another reminder that their voices and concerns were being pushed aside. Within 2 hours, the story became more than a headline. It became a rallying cry. For the first time in years, African unity felt real and urgent. In Burkina Faso itself, despite violence that has displaced over 2 million people, Traoré became a symbol of resistance and hope. Many see him as following in the footsteps of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who once inspired Africa. Surveys show that public support for military rule has grown sharply under Traoré, from only 24% in 2017 to 66% today. Crowds shouted his name not only in Ouagadougou, the capital, but also in London and Kingston, where African diaspora communities marched with Burkina Faso's flag. Banners read, "Respect Africa" and "Long live Captain Traoré." Inside the country, his reforms added strength to his message. He nationalized gold mines, began building the first gold refinery in Burkina Faso, and provided tractors to farmers to promote self-reliance. Yet, challenges remain. In the last year alone, over 7,000 people have died in Burkina Faso's conflict, far higher than before Traoré took power. Human rights groups warn that forced military service and limits on free speech could weaken his popularity if peace and stability are not restored. Even so, his ultimatum to Netanyahu was more than a bold statement. It was a demand for respect and sovereignty, a call that millions of Africans embraced as their own. The ticking clock became a symbol that Africa is no longer willing to be ignored. In Ouagadougou, people filled the squares with signs declaring, "Africa stands with Ibrahim Traoré." Student groups from Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria urged the African Union to act, even suggesting sanctions on any country that disrespects Africa's sovereignty. For many, this was not just about one man. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Africa itself. This wave of public support carried real political weight. In many countries, people are usually tired of politics and disappointed with their leaders. But this time was different. The ultimatum gave people a new sense of purpose. Commentators across Africa noted that it united Christians, Muslims, and even secular states. They all agreed on one thing: African dignity is not negotiable. In Burkina Faso, the effect was immediate. President Traoré, already popular for his nationalist message, saw his approval ratings rise sharply. Opposition leaders, who once spoke out against his military rule, grew silent. They feared that any criticism now would look unpatriotic at a time of national unity. Even the African Union, often accused of acting too slowly, began urgent talks. Insiders revealed that several states were preparing a joint response if Netanyahu refused to apologize within 12 hours. Still, some analysts warned that expectations were very high. If no real results came, disappointment could follow. But for the moment, the momentum was clear. Africa's politics were changing in a way that could not be easily undone. Beyond unity, the ultimatum opened new debates. In several parliaments, lawmakers called for a review of trade agreements with Israel. They argued that no partnership could continue without respect. South Africa, Namibia, and Tanzania even suggested that the entire continent might need to rethink its diplomatic ties if no apology was offered. Regional groups also began to shift. ECOWAS, once focused mostly on economics, started to debate whether it should take a stronger stand in foreign policy. The message was simple: African nations must stand together not only in trade, but also in dignity and respect. Inside Burkina Faso, the impact reached deep into society. Communities long divided by conflict found a new sense of unity. In villages hit by insurgency, leaders said people now saw their local struggles as part of Africa's larger fight for independence and respect. Even displaced families in refugee camps repeated Traoré's ultimatum around cooking fires. For them, it became a story of shared pride. But there were risks. International financial institutions quietly warned that Burkina Faso's bold stance could drive away investors or even invite sanctions from Western countries. European and American envoys asked Traoré's advisors whether the country planned to act beyond symbolic gestures. Still, across Africa, the ultimatum was praised as rare and historic leadership. Media coverage emphasized not only Traoré's courage, but also his silence afterward, a silence that placed the pressure squarely on Netanyahu. By the end of the 12 hours, one thing was clear. No matter the result, Africa's politics had already changed. The ultimatum set a new line in diplomacy, showing the world that Africa would no longer accept disrespect. And the shockwaves traveled far beyond Africa. From Washington to Paris, from Moscow to Beijing, the message was the same. African leaders can no longer be ignored. President Traoré had placed Africa firmly on the global stage, speaking with one clear voice. American political analysts reacted to Traoré's ultimatum with a level of intensity rarely seen for an African leader's words. It was not brushed aside as a passing headline or treated as just another episode in world politics. Instead, it was debated as a moment of real disruption, a rupture in the established order. For decades, Africa's political voice had been marginalized in Washington's corridors of power, often reduced to background noise amid global strategy. But now, a young captain from Burkina Faso had seized the microphone of history, and the world was forced to listen. In Washington, the responses revealed a sharp divide. Some voices, especially among traditional policymakers, branded Traoré's stance as reckless. They argued that such bold defiance could destabilize fragile alliances, especially in the Sahel, where American counterterrorism strategy has relied on cooperation with local governments. To them, Africa's leader was playing with fire, risking the region's stability and potentially complicating U.S. efforts against insurgent groups. Yet another camp, particularly among younger African American scholars, writers, and activists, read the moment in a completely different light. They saw not recklessness, but clarity. To them, Traoré had stripped away the veil of polite diplomacy and spoken with a rare honesty, the kind of clarity that comes when sovereignty is no longer asked for but declared. His words echoed with a resonance that reached back through centuries of struggle, from the civil rights marches in the United States to the anti-colonial movements that swept across Africa. On university campuses, the reaction was immediate. At Howard University, professors paused their lessons to let students debate what had just happened. At UCLA, student groups quickly organized forums, drawing large crowds that spilled out of lecture halls. Across these campuses, young Africans and African Americans spoke with fire in their voices. They debated what it meant to watch, live and unfiltered, an African president standing at a global summit and refusing to bow before the weight of world powers. They weren't just analyzing a speech, they were celebrating a courage that defied convention in full public view. In New York City, the African diaspora transformed Harlem into a stage of history. Thousands gathered, filling the same streets where civil rights marches had once thundered decades earlier. It was a sight both familiar and new echoes of the past meeting the energy of the present. Flags of the United States and Burkina Faso flew side by side in the late summer breeze, a symbol of solidarity that transcended borders. Chants rose up into the air. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. For these marchers, the issue was not isolationism, nor a rejection of cooperation with the outside world. It was about dignity. It was about drawing a line in the sand, declaring that partnership must be built on respect and equality. Handmade signs carried Traoré's ultimatum word for word. You have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome. Others held portraits of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, whose spirit seemed to live again in Traoré's bold defiance. For many in the crowd, it felt as if history had folded upon itself, linking the struggles of the 1,980 seconds with the courage of today's leaders. A new generation of uncompromising African leadership had risen from the same soil, and it was speaking with a voice the world could not ignore. Around the globe, the shockwaves traveled unevenly. In Moscow and Beijing, state-controlled media wasted no time in amplifying the moment. They hailed Traoré as a symbol of resistance to Western dominance, portraying his ultimatum as part of a broader movement, the Global South, rising to challenge the hierarchies of the old world order. They framed him as proof that Africa was no longer willing to play a secondary role in world politics. In Europe, the tone was more cautious, even nervous. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they called for constructive dialogue and respectful engagement. Yet analysts quickly noted the unease between the lines. For decades, Europe had assumed that Africa's leaders would ultimately toe the line of Western influence. Now that assumption was under threat. The balance of power in Africa was visibly shifting, and no amount of careful language could hide the discomfort it caused in European capitals. In the Middle East, the responses were sharply divided. Some governments criticized the move, warning that Traoré's ultimatum was a needless provocation that risked inflaming tensions further. Yet others, speaking in private, admitted admiration for the boldness of a small African nation forcing a seasoned power like Netanyahu onto the defensive. Even in regions far removed from the Sahel, Traoré's stance stirred conversations about sovereignty, pride, and the right of nations to be treated with dignity. Across all these perspectives, one truth was admitted openly or silently. Ibrahim Traoré had changed the rules of engagement. He did not plead for recognition, nor did he present Africa as a beggar waiting for favors. Instead, he declared with history behind him and the urgency of the moment before him that Africa already holds its place, its seat, and its dignity. He made it clear that Africa's presence at the global table was not conditional, not negotiable, and not to be ignored. For millions watching across Africa and throughout the diaspora, this was more than the words of one man. It was a vision. For the first time in a generation, they saw an African head of state stand before the world's cameras and refuse to bow. It was a vision of dignity, uncompromising and unmistakable, that no enemy could erase, and no ally could afford to overlook. Elders in villages repeated his words to the young, teaching them that sovereignty is lived, not granted. Activists in Europe and North America drew inspiration for their own struggles. Scholars compared the moment to the great declarations of past leaders who had redefined eras. And across the continent, from Dakar to Nairobi, ordinary citizens felt the weight of the ultimatum in their bones. This was more than a speech. It was a turning point. It was the reminder that Africa's dignity is not a request, not a favor, not something to be granted by the powerful. It is a truth to be declared and, when necessary, defended before the entire world. As the countdown edged closer to its final hours, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. With only 12 hours remaining, whispers began to circulate among diplomatic correspondents. Seasoned journalists, usually cautious in their language, spoke of unusual movements taking place behind the scenes. Rumors spread like wildfire. Israel was quietly reaching out to several African capitals, not with bold statements but through discreet channels, sending intermediaries to test the waters. There were no public apologies, no clear retractions, only carefully chosen phrases such as clarifying misunderstandings or seeking constructive dialogue. But timing matters in diplomacy, and everyone knew it. The message was not in the words but in the urgency. In Addis Ababa, seat of the African Union, senior officials understood at once. The ultimatum had struck its target. For decades, when African leaders raised concerns, the response from powerful nations had been silence, diversion, or dismissal. Now, even before the clock struck zero, hidden backroom negotiations had been set in motion. That fact alone, the shift from arrogance to hesitation, felt like a victory in itself. Back in Burkina Faso, the mood was electric, almost feverish. News of these rumors traveled not only through newspapers and social media, but also through radios in village squares, whispered conversations in mosques, and sermons in churches. Neighbors gathered to discuss what it meant. Farmers debated it as they tended their crops. Traders argued across market stalls. For once, the conclusion was unanimous. President Traoré had compelled one of the most entrenched powers in the world to pause, to rethink, to reconsider. This was no longer about Benjamin Netanyahu alone. This was about Africa's voice rising with conviction, demanding to be heard. The symbolism ran deep. Africa was not defending its dignity passively, waiting for the world to notice. Africa was actively shaping the story of global diplomacy. And for the first time in decades, the balance of power, however small, the tilt had shifted toward the continent. No armies were deployed, no economic blackmail was used. The weapon was simpler, sharper, and stronger. The unapologetic assertion of dignity. Parents told their children about it by candlelight. Teachers repeated it in classrooms. Even displaced families in makeshift camps repeated Traoré's words around their cooking fires. What emerged was not just political drama, but a living lesson for future generations. The right to stand tall is not a gift from others, it is a right you must claim yourself. When the final day arrived, many waited breathlessly for Netanyahu's apology. It never came. Yet the true twist lay elsewhere. In reality, what happened was even more powerful. Across Africa, leaders who once dismissed Traoré as a reckless soldier began to speak of him with respect. In Senegal, Ghana, South Africa, and beyond, officials quietly admitted that his stance had set a new standard for African diplomacy. Even governments with close ties to Israel could no longer ignore the new reality. Traoré had redrawn the boundaries of what was acceptable in Africa's dealings with the world. The ultimatum, then, was never only about whether one man apologized. Its deeper achievement was the shift in perception it created. In a single moment, one voice from the podium in Addis Ababa had altered the world's understanding of Africa. By refusing to bend, Traoré had not only defended Burkina Faso, he had lifted the dignity of an entire continent and placed himself among the lineage of leaders who define historical eras. And for millions watching, the message rang crystal clear. Africa does not beg for a seat at the global table. Africa builds its own table, and those who wish to join must come with respect. What began as a political ultimatum soon grew into something far greater. It became a mirror, showing Africans their own strength reflected back at them. From the rough hands of farmers in rural Burkina Faso to the spirited voices of students in Nairobi, from traders in Accra to community leaders in Johannesburg, everywhere people repeated the same words with pride. They understood at last. Sovereignty is not granted from above. It is lived, defended, and renewed by those who dare to claim it. The meaning reached beyond politics. It touched on something older than parliaments, older than treaties. It was about dignity, the timeless truth that no nation, however powerful, has the right to belittle another. Traoré's words resonated because they carried the echo of centuries. The long struggle of Africans against colonial chains, the sacrifices of independence movements, the voices of Sankara, Nkrumah, Lumumba, and countless unnamed fighters who refused to kneel. The ultimatum became their echo, alive again in the 21st century. It was not aggression, it was not isolation. It was the reaffirmation of a principle that endures. Freedom is never requested politely, it is claimed boldly. And then, as if sealing the meaning of the moment, Traoré himself declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free, we rise to claim it." For those who heard these words, whether in the villages of Burkina Faso or in the diaspora streets of London and New York, the impact was unforgettable. It was as if history itself had paused to take notice. And so the ultimatum ended not with the apology many expected, but with something far more powerful, a continent's rediscovery of its own strength. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré has touched your heart, share this story. Let the world know that Africa's voice will not echo faintly in the halls of others. It will roar, strong and unshakable, across the world. May God bless Africa.